Okay, this is Glenn Loury. The Glenn Show, blogheads.tv. I am with Brown University, and the Glenn Show is sponsored by the Watson Institute for Public and International Affairs here at Brown. I'm with John McWhorter, my frequent conversation partner. He's professor at Columbia University. We are Glenn and John, the black guys at bloggingheads.tv, self-styled. And we're here to regale you with our reflections on matters related to race and other things that are in the news these days. So thanks for joining me, John.
Happy to be here.
John, it seems like it's been a while since we talked. I think our fans are like thirsty to hear from us. It's been a month or something crazy like that, John.
Was Harvard already a month ago? It was.
Harvard was in April.
3 weeks ago, at least. Yeah.
Or very beginning of May, and here we are at the end of May. But anyway, so we're talking. What's on your mind these days, John?
Well, here in New York City, there has been a controversy because of the 8 public schools, elite public schools in this city that require a top score on the SHSAT exam, and that's the only metric that they use for admitting students. So with these 8 schools, the way you get in is you score above a certain point on this test. Now, the numbers of Black and Latino, but especially Black students, have plummeted at those schools, especially over about the past 20 years. So it's not that it was always so bad, but over the past 20 years, the numbers have plummeted so that this year, only 7 Black students were admitted to, for example, Stuyvesant, which is generally considered the flagship of all of these schools. So as a result, Mayor Bill de Blasio and various people are in favor of a policy of getting rid of the test and instead using quote unquote holistic admission standards. And it's been controversial because some people feel, and predictably I feel, and I wrote about this in the Atlantic, that what we might do is try to make it so that the Black kids get better at taking the test. And what's interesting to me is quickly 2 things. One, I'm not out in the woods on this the way I think I would have been 20 years ago. I've gotten very little blowback on that piece, and I do not unfollow or block people very often. Twitter will let you know what people think, and so will many other things. And there are a lot more people who understand the message than I think there would have been 20 years ago. And then second, I think that it is tragic how for somebody like de Blasio, and I'm going to call him out personally on this here. I didn't do it in writing. I'm going to say here. He's married to a Black woman, has a Black son. Yet people like him seem unable to imagine that any Black person who grew up in anything less affluent than a Cosby household could possibly do well on a standardized test. It's as if he thinks that Black people just can't be expected to do it. And I find that, in its way, racist. Now, I know that what he would say is that it's not that it's a Black thing, but if society doesn't deal you a very good hand, you're simply not going to do very well on these tests. But the thing is, we're in a city where so many Asian and Southeast Asian immigrants are from very poor families. And yet they manage, and my idea is we must teach these Black kids how to manage the test. I have faith. I don't think the mayor does. And all of his allies are the same. And I sometimes wonder why they don't.
Well, let me channel them for a moment here. No, we're not racist. We're simply realistic. We don't have faith, not in the kids. We don't have faith in the capacity of any intervention that you or some other clever test preparation expert might fashion. We don't have confidence that any such intervention would close the deficit in the actual cognitive and intellectual development of the young people in our city, which is reflected in the test. Such an argument might go, and I'll stop. The test is merely a messenger measuring what the kids know. There's no magic bullet to the test. What there is actual mastery over the material that the test tests. Unfortunately, because of many factors that we could point to, including poverty, disorganized families, the values of peers in a neighborhood, the quality of the schools that they're attending, and so forth and so on, but especially the culture in which they're embedded, the engagement of parents in their educational development, the extent to which they value and understand themselves to be, in some sense, defined by academic and intellectual work. That differs across communities in our city. That's a difference that's not going to be closed overnight, and certainly is not going to be closed by test prep. We can't wait until those large social deficits are corrected. And indeed, we don't really know how to correct them, but we do know how to integrate these schools, and that's what we're about.
Mm-hmm.
That's the argument as far as I can tell.
That was beautiful. It's that I wonder how many of them would actually say that culture was a problem. Even if they're going to say we don't know how to fix it. I think a lot of them are primed to just go, well, then not go crazy. They are primed to get angry if anybody mentions culture. The idea that if there's a cultural problem, it must be due to racism of some kind. And so how can you talk about culture? That's your good sociologist. I think with a lot of them, the idea just seems to be the schools these kids go to are just so lousy. And we've seen that turning the school system around is virtually impossible. We can't wait that long. So let's just get rid of the test and use more holistic measures. And, it's one of these things where if somebody on the left tells stories, it's called critical race theory, as we've discussed here. But if somebody who is not one of the party faithful tells a story, it's just an anecdote. But these days, I really am thinking a lot when I sit on New York's subways. And I use them a lot, and I use a lot of routes, and I find myself in a lot of different parts of the city for various reasons. And when you talk about the culture and you think about what kids are getting into those schools, as somebody with 2 eyes and half a brain, I cannot help but see that there is a clear difference in Black teen culture, which bleeds into Latino somewhat, but the epicenter is Black teen culture, and that of others. You can watch kids. You can watch clumps of kids at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And often I ride the train at 3, so I see this a lot. You can see the ones who are Indian in heritage. You can see the ones who are East Asian, mostly Chinese in heritage. And you can see the ones who are Black. And, I don't know these kids, but you do listen to what they talk about. And the ones who aren't Black are more likely to be talking about school and schoolwork. Not always, but more likely. The Black kids, much less likely. And more to the point, you can see how value comes in. And so you see that, the Asian kids, the Indian kids, etc., they're normal teenagers. They're listening to hip hop, the slouchy posture, the backpacks, the untied shoes, all of that. But you can see that there's a focus on, well, not even focus. None of them would give one another any crap for being good in school. There would be no such thing as, why are you hitting the books? You're not one of us. Now, I don't hear the Black kids saying that. You have to grow up Black and be in certain circles to have that lobbed in your face, or to watch it lobbed at other people. But what the Black kids value once they get on that train is showing one another how much they can act up. Sometimes it's pretty funny. A lot of them have great senses of humor, but they're working to see who can be the loudest, who can be the foulest, who can say fuck and nigger the most. And it's the boys, it's the girls, they're breaking each other up. And a lot of them are quite deliberately trying to épater le bourgeois. They are definitely enjoying making other people uncomfortable. That's what they do. Now, are they going to go out and shoot somebody? No. I think most of these people grow up and do all sorts of things. But when they're teens, I'm not fucking surprised that these kids don't do well on standardized tests. It's not part of what they value. It's clear. And so then when somebody like de Blasio thinks that the reason is racism, I think, no. There's subcultural differences in orientation. And where the parents fit in on all of this, all I can say is that the parents were these kids 20 years ago. It just gets passed on from one generation to the other. And it's so painfully clear, but I'm not sure how much you can quantify that. Or if you do try to quantify it, as Roland Fryer, for example, did, then you're told that you've got your numbers wrong and something's missing. It cannot become mainstream.
Let me just mention, since you cited Fryer, that earlier in his career, it's been 10 years now, he was chief equity officer, I believe it was called, for the public schools in New York City.
Oh, yeah.
Joel Klein, who was commissioner of education in New York at that time. Michael Bloomberg was the mayor. Fryer was a young economist at Harvard. friendly with Lawrence Summers, the president of Harvard at that time. And Summers put him in touch with the people in Bloomberg's office dealing with education. And he ended up spending a lot of time looking as a quantitative economist at a range of issues in the area of education, all of them oriented toward trying to boost the achievement of African-American disadvantaged minority youngsters, Latino, in the New York City school system. For example, he looked at whether paying kids small sums of money for doing well on frequently administered tests of their reading and math skills would motivate them to achieve more, and came to a negative conclusion about that. Paying kids to learn didn't seem to have much traction. He looked at charter schools in the city, did an evaluation of the Harlem Children's Zone, Jeffrey Canada's charter school network, and so on. And another thing that he did, I'm sorry, I'll just try to close this off, is try to measure this acting white phenomenon to which you were just referring, this cultural dynamic in which some communities might tend to punish kids who do well at school as it being uncool, not black, so-called acting white. And what he did was to find that for, in a data set that he examined for white kids, the popularity of a kid with other kids in the school tended to be increasing in tandem with their GPA. So the brighter kids, the kids who achieve more, were also the more popular kids. But for Black and Latino kids, that was not true, that the popularity of a kid rose with the GPA through about a B or B plus, but after that, it tended to tail off. So the kids who were doing very well were less popular. And this was an effort to try to measure this phenomenon. And you're right, it met with a lot of consternation and pushback. And I don't think necessarily effective rebuttal, but people anyway didn't want to accept these kind of results as confirming what they will call a canard. They will say it's a slander that Black kids are punishing other kids for learning. They'll say it's blaming the victim. And they'll say also that to the extent that you do see any of these cultural traits that might impede the acquisition of academic skills, those traits are themselves the product of oppression. So everything at the end of the day has to come back to structure. It has to, for a certain cast of mind, always return to the system, to the dispossession of African Americans, the mistreatment, the marginalization, the oppression, the suppression. And there's no room for agency for the idea that African Americans, by behaving differently, by a concerted effort to restructure the way things are working within our communities, could have any impact on the outcome. And that's where I think that's the core fault line, is a fault line between structure and agency. So a guy like de Blasio might be understood as saying, look, I just don't think there's much leverage via agency. I think if we don't reform the system, we're not going to get anywhere. Me personally, I disagree with that view, but it's going to be very hard to disabuse some of these people of this way of looking at the world. They have so much invested in it.
Yeah, it will. I mean, you can't cut through it. It's interesting how strong the evidence for the whole acting white thesis is. People 50 years from now are going to be bemused looking at how people like you and me got so much shit for expressing these sorts of things. I mean, it's funny. You mentioned Roland back in the day with those experiments, and I'm thinking how long it's been, even for me, at this point. It was now almost 20 years ago that John Ogbu, the anthropologist, the Black anthropologist,
the late John Ogbu.
Late John Ogbu. Part of the reason his stuff hasn't gotten around more is because he passed and hasn't been able to promulgate it. But he showed that in Shaker Heights, Ohio, this idea that doing well in school is a white thing was overt. And there was even a documentary made where you had Black kids sitting there saying, I didn't do well at school because my boys told me that it was white for me to make good grades. They're sitting there saying it. And this got around enough that, I knew about it. And yet it's as if none of that stuff was written. And, a couple of times I've written a piece about something else where I just kind of tip my cap to the acting white issue. And, there's this little posse of people out there who write these indignant articles about how I'm basing these ideas on junk science and how dare Barack Obama mention the acting white, it's been disproven. And their arguments simply don't go through, partly because they don't even gather the evidence. One of these days, I have a list that I made way back in the early 2000s. I've stopped adding to it. But I had well over 100 testimonies from people who wrote to me unbidden about being told that they were white for liking school. When Losing the Race came out, people just wrote and wrote and wrote. And I really did only keep the ones that exactly said, I was told I was white for liking school, not somebody made fun of me for being effeminate or somebody told me I didn't wear the right pants, but exactly white for liking school. And it was, I think I got to about 116. And, there are all these tragic little tales. And, if you had 6 anecdotes about the cops, that would be considered, sacrosanct, ironclad proof that living in America as a black man is all about running from the cops every time you step outside your door. But when it comes to all these testimonies, this crowd of people who don't want you to talk about acting white suddenly, have nothing to say, or they dare to suppose. And this is a Jamel Bowie thing, actually, not to call him out, but I remember he wrote somewhere that the people who claim that that's what was said to them are misunderstanding what they were being told, that it was a problem with the way they dress or it was a problem with the way they act. And I think he recounted something that had happened to him. And maybe that's true of what happened to him. But to tell you the truth, it is rather nervy, I'll just put it that way, to say that hundreds and hundreds of people, or even 100 people, who say this happened to them didn't quite understand what the score was, because nobody would dare say that about these accounts of people being trailed in stores by cops, where, for example, often you're being trailed in stores by people who work in the store, when often you're being trailed because they are assigned to come after customers and see if they can make a sale. Or many of the stories that people tell about their encounters with the cops, where, frankly, once you dig in, you find out that either the cops were right, that happens sometimes, or that it was all much more ambiguous than it seemed. And that's certainly not true of many of the cases that we've heard, but it was true, for example, of Ferguson. And so, we're not going to convince the usual suspects that there is a cultural problem here. But I think that you can do a surgical strike on simply the issue of the tests. And maybe I am missing something here, but I'm thinking you can take those trash-talking kids, who think that there's something black about acting up, and say, look, you've got to learn how to fill in these bubbles. You are going to have to get good at the math that you've been taught, which frankly isn't that high-level math. You need to spend the summer really working on this. Because if you want to get into one of these schools, you just have to take this stupid little test. And I wonder if that can be done. Because no, we're not going to convince the establishment that the problem is that these kids have drunken in, through no fault of their own, a sense that the proper black kid is all about being loud and standing up to the establishment rather than buckling down and taking a test. These kids can't help it. But I hope you can teach kids how to take a test, because I'm done. You and I don't know how to get through to a culture either. How can that be changed?
Yeah, well, that's a big one, of course. I want to say a couple of things first before trying to tackle the big one. One is about Agbu. So John Agbu, the late John Agbu, the anthropologist, developed a theory which was not only applicable to African Americans in our educational sector, but he found parallels in societies around the world, something he called oppositional identity or something like that. I hope I get this exactly right. I think he called them oppositional identities. And what he was saying is, for people, a group of people who have been held down and discriminated against and mistreated, they may develop a culture of rejection of the norms of the larger society as part of their self-definition, because they don't want to, be associated with the structures and values and norms that are characteristic of the society that's oppressing them. And he found evidence of this amongst the Gypsy Roma people in Southeastern Europe. He found it amongst I think they're called Hianachi. I may get that wrong, but I'm talking about the Korean-descended residents of Japan, who are the offspring and descendants of people who were brought in for contract labor from Korea during the period when Japan was expanding in an imperial way in East Asia, and others. So it was not simply about Black Americans. The other thing I want to say is that I've been teaching this book the last couple of years with my undergraduates in my course on race and inequality called The Asian American Achievement Paradox. The authors are Min Zhou, Z-H-O-U, and Jennifer Lee, who are sociologists. They interview a couple of hundred families in Southern California trying to figure out amongst Vietnamese and Chinese immigrant families, first and second generation, how is it that so many of these kids do so well? And it's interesting because the Vietnamese population is on the whole less well-educated, the first generation of immigrants, and less economically secure. The Chinese American population are better educated. They tend to be better educated and wealthier. But they're there cheek by jowl in greater Los Angeles, and they are part of a larger so-called Asian American culture, which does things like demand that kids get A's. If they come home with an A- or a B+, it's simply not acceptable to the parents. Orient the kids towards STEM discipline studies, because if you know math and engineering and science and medicine, there's no way anybody's going to be able to discriminate against you because the knowledge is in your head. They can't do, they're going to have to deal with you. That are creating institutions within the community like these after-school schools where kids go and learn how to take the test, among other things, that have peer cultures where, the kid who's celebrated, who's the star, who's the superstar, is the one who manages to get into Harvard, not the one who makes the basketball team. And please forgive me for what might sound like a kind of stereotype, but it's just true. They value this. They value it greatly, and it has consequences for their behavior. Enormous amount of time spent during the day on study and whatnot. Control over the kids watching up television and things of this kind. You could go on. Now, I don't know how that's not culture. I mean, as you mentioned, among the Asian kids who are getting admitted to the Bronx High School of Science and other exam schools in New York City, half of them are not advantaged kids. They're disadvantaged. They are coming from relatively poor families. So the idea that poverty accounts for this, or structural disadvantage accounts for this disparity by ethnicity and race and performance on these tests, I think is demonstrably false. But there's something that we haven't mentioned, and that's about the structure of the family. That's about single parenthood. That's about mothers with children without a husband, with only one income, with only 24 hours a day of parental supervision time available to look after the kids. Mothers who may be struggling to get by and they may be under a lot of stress, may not be able or equipped to provide the kind of support from the cradle onward that kids need in order to develop their human potential. I don't know how that's not culture. I don't know how the structure of childbearing and child rearing, family formation, household formation, and whatnot is not culture. So that I just wanted to go on the record to say there's an intellectual and kind of academic tradition here that's very respectable that talks about these things. But you asked me how to fix culture. And I have to say, I don't really know how, but I do know that if you don't identify the problem, there's absolutely zero chance of being able to do anything about it.
Yeah, it's indicative here that when you talk about these Chinese and Vietnamese American families and the kids and what they value, I think anybody who's being honest would say that if you're thinking about a Black American version of that, there are an awful lot of people who are thinking that they wouldn't be Black. That, I think, is the feeling in the pit of a lot of people's stomachs, both white and Black, that Black kids who had those values wouldn't be Black. And talk about oppositional culture, there's a certain value in that version of being Black, that people cherish the idea that being Black is partly having a certain wariness of and sense of separation from the dominant culture, because the dominant culture has been and sometimes still is so abusive. And so I think for a lot of people, the idea is, yeah, good for you, resisting the culture. And a lot of white people are now trained to celebrate Black people for doing that. But what it means is that what these Chinese and Vietnamese families do would be incompatible with being an authentically Black person in many people's eyes. And I don't think it's an accident to the extent that we can imagine brown-skinned, i.e. dark brown-skinned parents fostering those kinds of values. We imagine them as being immigrants from the Caribbean and Africa. My sense of these things is that that is much easier to imagine if your parents are from Ghana or Nigeria. But if your parents are from Cleveland, then chances are it's not that you're being told not to do well in school, but there isn't that, frankly, sometimes punitive pressure to do well on the tests, to study STEM, even if STEM isn't exactly what you're really most interested in. I mean, there are downsides to that Tiger Mom, Amy Chua way of bringing kids up. Sure. But there are definitely issues of identity. And I really have no idea how you would get that through to people that, yes, you, Black mom and Black dad, you have to teach your kid to hit those books and not just read the books. It's not about sitting down and reading, but learning how to do what the professors want you to do, what the teachers want you to do, and do it really well, to the extent that you're not doing an awful lot of other things. And you have to get to the point that the kids are going to tease each other a little bit about not being good in school. There's a movie called Me, Myself, and Irene. It's one of the ones by the Farrelly brothers that didn't do all that well. And they had a really cute little bit in it where three, as I recall, very dark, chunky, vernacular, cussing, drinking, pot smoking Black guys are doing everything you would expect, all the motherfucker and all that, but they also value school. And so they're trash talking each other about not doing well on a test, about not knowing what this is, not knowing what that is. And I thought that is a fantastic fantasy. But sadly, it's a fantasy. And so, yeah, I think we need more local solutions, because there's still a sense. Although, something, Glenn, here's something where I genuinely don't know. Acting White, I grew up watching it, and so it was definitely real in the 70s and 80s, and anybody who wants to tell me that I didn't know what I was seeing can frankly go to hell. It was real. And it was not aimed at me. I was lucky. I had a very sharp tongue. I had my problems, but nobody was going to throw that at me. But I watched it thrown at my friends. It was clear, it was obvious, and it was not a fluke. But I was writing about it in the early 2000s when it was real. I don't know if it is now. I haven't studied it since then. I wonder if there's been a cultural change, because I don't spend any time with 15-year-old any kids, frankly. And so I wonder if maybe there was a sea change in the culture, just like there's been a sea change in teen pregnancy in general. To be honest, I doubt it. I would be surprised if this had changed. But it's at the point where I can't say that I know that it's happening this afternoon. I know that it happened this afternoon 20 years ago. But I wonder if it's changed. And I'm sure there are other people who know.
Yeah, well, that's the thing for systematic study, I think, by people who do the interviews and look at the data and such. And neither one of us is an expert. I did want to mention, though, that I don't think you can underestimate the importance of parenting from day one, not just seeing that the kid goes to school and doing their homework. I'm talking about reading to the kid before the kid can read to herself. I'm talking about making sure they know their numbers, their shapes, their colors, about stretching their vocabularies, about challenging them with mind-developing play, about taking them to the zoo, to the museum, children's museum, science museum, whatever it might be, about making sure that some of the content that they're consuming on electronic media are developmentally focused. And, whether it be Sesame Street or whatever. I'm too old now. My kids are all over 27 years old or older. So
I don't know what and better too.
I don't know what the current resources would be, but there are resources out there that are oriented toward pressing these kids' development, about paying attention to what happens at their school, about going to the parent-teacher association meetings, about meeting with the teacher, about asking about the homework, about finding out whether the kid is being challenged, about learning and knowing your kid well enough to know, well, they're good at this, but they're not so good at that, and doing the relevant compensatory parental interventions associated with that knowledge. It's a full-time job, which is why it's very hard to do in a household where there's only one adult. And I say this with trepidation because I know people will, react by saying, well, you're blaming the victim, you're putting this on people, they deserve help. And of course they do deserve help, but no one can actually do the parenting job. I mean, this is one of the things that concerns me about the faith that people have in universal pre-K, daycare and preschool. And I'm not against that. I'm for that. Okay, I want to be clear. I'm not against universal pre-K. but it's not a panacea and it's not a substitute for parenting. The parent has to reinforce what's happening in the institution and build on it. You can't substitute for a parent. The parent is there all the time. The kid goes home to an environment that either does or does not foster that kid's intellectual development. So, again, diagnosis is easier than cure, but I don't think you get a cure unless you have the right diagnosis. And for my money, the developmental processes in which young people of color are embedded are fundamental. And by the way, this is not just amongst poor families. I mean, the underperformance of African Americans as measured by intellectual and academic achievement is manifest throughout the socioeconomic scale. The gap in test scores is also evident amongst those who are from relatively well-off families. Yes.
Glenn, hold on, just freeze for a second, because I know Blogging Heads likes this. Blogging Heads, this is Gracie, who is my cat after Laura. He has come to make her debut. Anyway, Glenn, go ahead.
Yeah, no, Bob Wright likes it anyway, because I've been watching him and seeing his pet come on the scene from time to time. Bob Wright is the guy that oversees everything that happens at Blogging Heads. So hats off to you, Bob. We've got a pet too. At least one of us does.
Gracie, Bob.
No, I was just saying parenting is fundamental. And I was saying that the racial gap expresses itself throughout the social class hierarchy, so that even amongst middle and upper middle class African Americans, our youngsters are testing on average below those of from other racial ethnic groups. And it's a real problem. Now,
go ahead.
No, I was just going to put the genetic or biogenetic issue of population differences on the table, and intelligence and whatnot, so we can dismiss it, and I'll leave that to you. But, there are people out there who are thinking, well, you guys are banging your head against a brick wall. Don't you know there's a standard deviation difference in IQ of the African descendant and the European descendant populations in this country, and that the Asian descendant populations have a slightly higher IQ than the European descendant populations? And that stuff's been going on for a long time. So there's only so much you can do, because the capacities of people are, to some degree, on average, limited by their inheritance.
Yeah, all that. Yeah, we've talked about that.
Yeah, we have.
I've written about it in the National Review, and my intuition, and in this case, this intuition is that if that IQ difference exists, and it's just on the average, but still that doesn't eliminate the discussion, so much more, or at least as much, could be explained just by a cultural aspect of this, which I find it hard to put my finger on. If I had another 2 lives instead of another 1, I figure I've got another 20 years of not being senile. If I had 40.
Whoa. How old are you? You're not going to say. You're in your early 50s. I'm 70, okay? So I'm not senile. I want everybody to understand that.
Well, 20 years of
not yet. I'm thinking of myself having another 20 years before senility. So you got a good 35, John.
Yeah, all right. If I had even longer, I would like to study it. But you know something? I'm going to regret this, but I think there are things that need to be on the record. And yes, we are identifiable as people in this society. I'm going to say this as discreetly as I can, because I need this. My daughter is 7, and you talk about the 2 parents, and I started teaching her to read from a reading teaching book when she was 4, because the schools, good public schools she was going to in New Jersey, but they weren't doing it fast enough. And I kind of thought, wouldn't it be nice for her to be able to read as quickly as possible, because it's easier on a parent? And so that gave her a good head start. And so we talk about reading because of that head start I gave her a few years ago. She was one of the top 2 readers in her class last year, and now she's the top one. This is not bragging. She got this weird help from her father. Of course she's ahead.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting is that we've talked about reading a little bit, because she really did have a big breakthrough about 6 months ago, the chapter books, and now she can read, within reason, almost anything that a person might want to read. It's a miracle, even to a linguist, to see the phase shift in it. And very casually, we were talking about reading a couple months ago, and I said, So Dolly, now that you're in first grade, everybody in the class can read, though, basically, right? Like some people are faster than others. Like maybe you're the best, but everybody can read, right? And she said, yeah, some people are better than others, although, except, and she gave a name. This is a class of about 16, 17 people, and this is a very cozy neighborhood. There is no grinding poverty in this neighborhood, which is Jackson Heights, Queens. People are going to look, so I might as well say. And she said, well, except such and such. And from the name of such and such, I had a suspicion. So I asked her, what color is such and such? And that is, other than her, the one black person. And I thought maybe that's an accident. Maybe. But frankly, something's going on there, and it's not that person has a low IQ. I'm almost sure that person only has one parent, however, and that probably has something to do with it. And, you just get into, there are cultural factors here. There's a reason why that person is reading behind the other people. And it's not that they're dumb. It's that there are subtle differences in priority between the typical in this neighborhood is a South Asian kid, so Parvati's home, as opposed to this person's home, which means that, I'm sure this person will catch up, but at 7, this person is one of those kids who can't read. And we've all known 7-year-olds who can't read. There's nothing pathological about it, but a 7-year-old can already be reading. This person isn't one of them, and I think it's because they're black, but it's not because, one, it's not because they're poor, because they couldn't be. They'd be in a different neighborhood. And 2, it's not because they're dumb. But there is something. I don't know how you would identify what it was. You'd have to sit with that person and watch the sorts of things that they're not saying or saying to their kids. You can't fix that. It can't be fixed. It would have to take care of itself like teen pregnancy, and nobody would quite know why. But you can teach people how to take care of it.
I think of, let me give a couple of examples of what I regard as large-scale cultural change. Smoking. Okay? Mm-hmm. Everybody used to smoke. Almost nobody does now, although it's coming back and people are vaping and stuff like that. But you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. Everybody used to smoke. And it really changed. It needed to change. Racial consciousness around, conking your hair, a kind of pride in blackness. Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. I watched this documentary biopic on James Brown, the rise of James Brown, the other night on Netflix. Watched that. It's very good, man. James Brown is one hell of a musician, and he was one hell of a human being. He didn't end as well as he might have, but you can't help but be impressed by his rise from poverty and relative obscurity.
Yeah.
And by the time you get to the late 60s and early 70s, James Brown is a race man who's going around telling people, say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. And I don't want nobody to give me nothing. Just open up the door and I'll get it myself, this kind of thing. But I just mentioned him as one example of a large transformation of consciousness among African Americans about identity and whatnot, in which like a shame at being black was to some degree displaced, and a different sensibility emerged. I'm not sure. I think it's very difficult to imagine policy interventions that affect these kind of transformations, but the messaging that comes through media that might be reinforced informally in the home and in the school and in the church and in the community and by the people who write op-ed pieces and who set the tone for cultural discussion can over time have its effect. I think attitudes around gender have changed tremendously. I think attitudes around sexuality, sexual identity, sexual practices have changed tremendously. These are cultural things, but you can't, push on a string and kind of make this whatever you want it to be. It's some sense it has to be organic or something like that. I don't have a full theory here about cultural change, but it seems to me not at least worth thinking in a systematic way about that kind of thing.
Everybody should stop smoking because it kills you. So
yeah.
They kind of helped. Or
it's not cool. It's not as cool as you think it is. It looks cool right now, but 30 years of that and your lungs are crap.
And you can't, right.
And how cool is that? How cool is that?
That works. Or stop conking your hair, say you're black and you're proud, and that makes you feel good, and you're sticking your finger in Whitey's eye. And so you're talking about good feelings. And I don't have any problem with any of that in 1968. I get it. Good feelings. Whereas this one is harder because what you're saying is hit the books. Yeah. It's not cool to be a trash-talking, sexy, funny loudmouth. That's not cool. Instead, you have to hit the books so that you're going to get a good job. That doesn't hit the viscera because it's not saying you're going to die, and it's not saying go have a good time. And I think that's what makes it so hard. And so, for example, teen pregnancy, roughly you can think it has something to do with people not wanting to have kids young, but that didn't seem to bother people for a long time. It's a mystery as to why people, knocked off the teen pregnancy. It just kind of happened. I was hoping that Obama would help set the tone that you're talking about. I wrote a piece in New York Magazine that, now, looks very quaint, where I thought that maybe he would help set a change. But social media came in, and instead what everybody started thinking about was Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown. And I think that sidelined any sense of a new form of Black identity. It'd be interesting to see what had happened if Obama had had 2 terms and the iPhone was only invented next year from now. But we'll never know.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
We were going to do that other thing.
Yeah, let's do that. There was something I wanted to say here, though, and it had to do with respectability politics and the pushback that Obama got when he did try to do a little bit of this.
There was some.
My brother's keeper ended up getting attacked by a lot of people on the left for, in effect, stressing agency over structure. That's basically what it came down to. Obama was trying to individualize and personalize the responsibility, my brother's keeper, when in fact what we needed was a higher minimum wage, more money for schools, the federal government as employer of last resort, anti-discrimination, reparation for the long-lasting effects of slavery, et cetera, et cetera. So this contempt for the idea of respectability, pull up your socks. I mean, you're not going to just tell them, read the book, so that you'll make something of yourself. You're telling them, put a belt on those pants and get them up around over your hips. You're telling them, show up at school. You're telling them hanging out with the wrong people is no place for anybody who wants to make something of themselves to be. You're telling them, 6 hours a day of consuming hip hop videos is a really poor expenditure of your time when you're 15 years old, things like that. And yes, you're telling them the pride of the race depends upon what you do with yourself. We can't just assert that we are somebody. We have to be somebody. That requires effort, this kind of thing. People have contempt for that way of looking at the world.
Yeah, it's a really hard thing in how that kind of contempt has penetrated. And it's funny because the minute you step beyond the sorts of people you and I spend time with, all of this stuff is much more easily accepted. I think of my family. My brother's keeper, they would think all that made perfect sense. Yeah. There are people in my family who've gone, quote unquote, the wrong way, and everybody loves them. But there's a sense that, maybe you shouldn't have done that, and here's what you need to do. It's not, the idea that it was society's fault is not something that most of them would think about, or they will think about it if you bring it up, but they're not waiting for society to change. And I guess we're supposed to think of all that as unenlightened, whereas I feel like that's an insult to people who are not unenlightened. Many of the people who in my family talk about these things are, watching the news and thinking about things and reading things, even if they didn't happen to go to college. And I just don't know. But it's funny another one of these subway differences. I guess it would come off better if I were an artist and I'd make a play. So then it would be called a statement. But if I were a playwright, I'd have to use 3 names. It would have to be John Hamilton McWhorter V, and I write plays about the train. Then I'd get taken seriously about this sort of thing.
August Wilson only had 2 names, John.
That is true. He got away with it somehow. But you see on the train, if somebody is begging on the train, and okay, sometimes that's what life does to you.
Yeah.
The white guy begging on the train is like something out of the Great Depression. He's ashamed. He's quiet. He's apologetic. He's sorry to take up your time. Almost always. Gracie, come on. There is a kind of black man who begs on the train. There are 2 kinds. One kind is humble like that. It tends to be the ones who've gotten a little bit older. I'm sorry to take up your time. I'm down on my luck. Give me some money. Get the ones who are, say, 23 or older, and I know how this sounds, me saying the ones, you've got two kinds. I'm sorry, but I've been riding these trains for 20 years. You got two kinds. There's the older guy. The younger ones have this chip on their shoulder. It's a routine that they often do, which is that they get mad at the people in the train car for not looking up from their phones and engaging them. So they're angry that they're not getting more money. And even if that's a ploy, even if they've been taught to act that out because that sucks some more money out of people's pockets, still, it's only the black guys that do that. And where they're getting it is society owes me a living, that I'm down on my luck, but it's partly you white people from the Upper West Side's fault. And so when I come through on the train, cocky and menacing, you are still going to look up and you're going to at least greet me warmly with your eyes. And at least every fifth one of you is supposed to give me $1. And if I walk through the car being menacing and obnoxious and nobody looks up, then it's you guys' fault. And he's going to cuss everybody out before he goes into the next car. I'm sorry. That, in my experience, is only a black man, the occasional Latino. But that's a black thing. And it's because of what's penetrated. I'm going to venture, you can maybe correct me on this, I'm going to venture that train beggar didn't exist until roughly 1969. If that guy was begging in the train in 1953, he would have been like somebody from the Great Depression.
Yeah, I was alive in 53, but I was only 5 years old, so I can't verify from firsthand experience, but I think you're roughly right. You know what, it puts me in the mind of this brilliant novel by the Nobel-winning novelist J.M. Coetzee, the South African. Mm-hmm. The novel is called Disgraced, and it's about post-apartheid South Africa and relations between whites and blacks and so on. Obviously, I can't tell the story of the novel here, but this idea of belligerence being expressed by the people after the transition of black people toward whites, and the white, a certain cast of mind amongst the whites feeling guilty about the oppression and accepting the belligerence as their due, and feeding it in a certain way. He very controversial within literary circles, but he captures it brilliantly, I think, and I do think there's something to it. I don't know. What do you think? Do we have time to talk about adversity index that the College Board has announced? It's related to what we were talking about before.
We can do it as a coda.
Okay.
I would say that. Well, you bring it on.
Okay. So the College Board has announced recently that they were going to formulate an index of the adversity faced by students who take the scholastic achievement tests that are used by colleges to make admissions decisions. And what they're going to do is they're going to produce an index of the adversity of the student that they're going to share with the colleges when they distribute the test scores to the colleges, but they're not going to share it with the families of the test takers. And the index, as I understand it, is going to combine measures of disadvantage in the community from which the kid comes, the residential community, the district in whatever city or town they live, in terms of the poverty rate, the crime rate, and various other measures of social disadvantage at the community level. Disadvantage within the family, the household from which the child comes. There are 3 dimensions to this index: community and family. So are 2 parents present? What's the family income? What's the education of the parents? And so on. And then also disadvantage of the school where the kid was educated. How many were on, lunch subsidy? What was the average level of academic performance of kids at the school? Things of this kind. So though an index will be created based on those measures, which will proxy the amount of adversity, I think this is the theory behind this, that a student who presents a particular SAT test score had faced. This has been controversial. Heather McDonald has denounced it in the Manhattan Institute's journal, City Journal. The fine African-American writer Thomas Chatterton Williams has a piece recently in the New York Times where he calls it bogus. And he argues that adversity is real, but using, in effect, proxies for minority status as a measure of adversity reduces a complex aspect of the human experience down to a sociological quantitative measure that is only there for one reason and one reason only, and we know what it is, you all want to admit more black students to the college. The black students have lower SAT scores than other people. And so you're looking for an indirect way of being able to do that. This is Thomas Williams. I hope I don't do him a disservice in summarizing so briefly what he wrote in the New York Times recently. But in any case, there you are. The SAT has felt pressured or has seen an opportunity. And I'm not sure what the backstory is on this. It could just be pressure. Give us a means of getting around this problem because we have minority students with low test scores, or it could be that they see a market opportunity and they're responding to it. Give their customers, who are college admissions committees, the tools that they need in order to be able to make prudent decisions. So they talk about it as putting the SAT score in context. Okay, so you've got the SAT score. The black kids are 200 points on average or more below the white kids. And the Asian kids are are ahead of the white kids on the other side. And you've got the disadvantage in the test scores, and they want to put it in context by providing colleges with a measure of the adversity that students who took the test faced. That's my broad summary of this new innovation in college achievement, admissions testing. What do you think about that?
It's funny about adversity. Remember the story that I told a couple of shows ago about the Clarence who lived next door to me?
Yes.
The guy who, he and I are anatomically the same person. His family make a little more money than my family does. We basically live in the same house. But he ended up basically turning his garage into a drugstore, and he went to prison. Yeah. And it's interesting how the adversity would go. I guess both him and I are modern equivalents. And I'm sure you can go to that street and the same two kids are living in those houses.
Yeah.
Him and I would both get adversity scores because it's so hard to be black. Now, I think anybody who actually engaged us individually would see that, my life hasn't been perfect, but I would not have deserved any kind of adversity score. And if he deserved an adversity score, maybe it would be partly that his parents weren't quite as educated as mine. They were significantly less educated than mine. Might be partly that. But then the adversity might also be, there were reasons that he was not likely to do well on standardized tests. I don't have to wonder whether Clarence would have done a good job on the SAT if he ever took one. Almost certainly not. Not him, not his friends, for the reasons we've discussed during this particular show. But the adversity would be that he was raised in a culture that subtly did not inculcate him with the orientations that would allow you to be good at a test. It isn't racism because it was the set of Leave It to Beaver, and he never wanted for anything in any way. And so there would be a lot of that. Now, some people would say, well, to make an omelet, you have to crack some eggs. There are always going to be some infelicities, but we have a larger purpose. But what does worry me is that at UC Berkeley, around the time that I left, starting in about the year 2000, admissions were conditioned on something that was called a hardship score. I imagine they still are. And that was transparently a way of getting around the ban on racial preferences that had come down a few years ago in the late 90s. That was obviously why they were doing it. Of course, nobody would say it in so many words, but it was clear. And I liked it in itself in that when I was using it, when I was on admissions committees once or twice before I left, the hardship made sense. And I remember not only did it bring in Black and Latino kids who had grown up on the wrong side of the tracks, but also you could do that for some of the white kids. We actually brought in a coal miner's daughter, a white coal miner's daughter.
Yeah.
And remember, she did, very well at what she was brought in to do. But there were two problems. One was that I remember bringing in on a hardship score a very upper middle class Black girl from Canada. And it made no sense at all. She hadn't had any hardship. She was just brown skin. And I knew her a little bit, and she had had a little bit of this and a little bit of that in her life. But this made no sense. The coal miner's daughter had hardship. This person had just grown up as an upper middle class North American. And then the main problem was that, and I think Heather McDonald has written about this too, and I wrote about it way back, I think in the Washington Post or something, which is that really, in practice, hardship was tilted towards brown kids. And so if a Korean American kid said that his mother had died of breast cancer and he had had to A, B, and C, well, he didn't get in. Whereas a Mexican kid saying the exact same thing got in. There were people who noticed that this sort of thing happened way too many times for it to be an accident. There was clearly a Black/Latino bonus factored in, which was not supposed to be part of it. I worry that that's what might go on here. Maybe the system could be made so that that weren't done, but I doubt it, because the goal really is to bring in more brown kids. And so I just hope that what they're calling adversity, I hope they'll act like that's really what they're after, especially since the idea, especially over the past 20 years, that you also want to bring in disadvantaged white people is not crazy. And people talk about it a lot more than they used to. And so as long as it isn't, the idea isn't that it's adverse to be you and me, because it's oversimplified. It needs to actually be applied as to what the meaning of that word is.
Well, they can't do it just explicitly on race. I mean, that's the thing that they're trying to get around. You can't get adversity points just for being Black. You have to get adversity points for coming from a single parent family, or coming from a neighborhood that had a high crime rate, or coming from a high school where the proportion of kids getting free lunch type of subsidy was a high.
So there's
number.
no wiggle room in the adversity scoring at all, where they could factor in nevertheless.
Well, what they can do is they can indirectly get at race by putting emphasis in the index on just those factors which differ most between Blacks and others. So if you're trying to bring Blacks in, and you know that the out-of-wedlock birth rate amongst African-American mothers is 70%, and that more than half of Black kids are being raised in families with a household with a single parent, then if you put a lot of emphasis on single parenthood, you're not going to get many Koreans getting a boost with that, because their families are in greater two-parent status. But you're going to get a lot of African-Americans. So you can say, I'm just measuring the family, but the net effect of what you did would be to boost the prospects of African-Americans.
So it's already baked into the system.
It would be baked into the correlation between the measures of adversity that you use, which are non-racial, and the racial identity of the students who might exhibit a high, index on that particular measure. That's why I say the weight, that the weight that you put on the different dimensions of the index really matters a lot. If you weight those things in the index that differ most by racial group, you'll end up indirectly subsidizing racial groups. The thing I want to say, though, is that the proof of the pudding should be in the eating, by which I mean the index could be helpful. It is more information, after all. You're giving the college more information than they had before. So if the college is trying to predict which students are going to perform best, more information theoretically is better than less. I got the same SAT score, 600 on the math. Now, if the kid came from Greenwich, Connecticut, a 600 on the math is not all that impressive. If the kid came from the South Bronx, a 600 on the math might be telling you this is a really smart kid who came from a relatively rotten school, but nevertheless got a 600 on the math. So if I'm after smart kids, it helps me to take that 600 and to quote, place it in context, close quotes. But as I say, the proof should be in the eating, which is to say, ex post facto, I should see that kid from the South Bronx with the same 600 doing better in college after having been admitted than the kid from Greenwich with the 600. And we can look at that. That's a measurable phenomenon that we could look at. So I would like to see the College Board commit itself to studying over a longer period of time, the consequences of the use of the adversity index that they are introducing, to see whether or not kids, given their SAT score on the academics, who have high adversity, do better in college than other kids with the same SAT score who have low adversity. If that's true, they would have, I think, powerful ammunition for saying, yes, this should be used, not only or even mainly as a proxy for explicit racial discrimination, but as a tool to allow the colleges to select more effectively from those applicants who apply the kids who are actually going to prosper at their school. And by the way, most of those kids are going to be white because most kids are white and most kids suffering adversity are white.
Mm-hmm. So in other words, what would worry me is how colleges are using this information. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, the colleges know who has adversity scores and who doesn't.
Yeah, my understanding is that the colleges will know. The score will not be communicated to the family of the test taker,
right? But
it will accompany the report of the test outcome that goes to the college.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in itself, I certainly get where it's coming from. But I have issues of trust, and we'll just have to see how it goes. But I think that the theme of this has been, the black nerd. How do you create the black nerd? And how do you get rid of the idea that it's unusual to be both black and a nerd? And we're going to have to see how that goes. Remember Urkel?
I do not. Urkel.
Urkel was a goofy black nerd with stooped over posture and glasses on a very goofy ABC sitcom called Family Matters. And he was an iconic character.
Okay, I can picture this individual. That's just...
Yeah, and so he's this idiot. And, Urkel is a memorable totem, but still, it's not an accident that the nerdy black guy was a complete buffoon. And things have changed in the pop culture since then. They've changed a lot. But I wonder if it could change more in the regular culture beyond black immigrant families. That's the thing. Can it change for black people from Cleveland? And I guess we just have to see.
Well, John, I think the reason the followers of our dialogue love you so is that you have such a pithy way of summarizing, the issues that are at play in some of these subtle and controversial themes.
I like pithy.
Yeah, I like what you do, man. So great. We've had a good conversation. We will talk again in due course. I want you to know that I'm going to record a bunch of conversations between now and the end of May, and then I'm shutting down for the entire month of June, where I'm going to retreat to do something that I will not speak of here, but that the world will be happy when I get it done. We'll talk in July again. Is my forecast, assuming you're available.
I will be around most of July.
Very good. Take care, my friend.
You too.